This is an internal Secret Service memo they never wanted exposed. The resignation letter that cracked the public image of unshakable loyalty and revealed a rupture inside the agency sworn to protect the president. What is emerging now, through leaks and confirmations out of the Department of Homeland Security, is what insiders have been quietly warning about for weeks. The United States Secret Service is facing a crisis of morale and authority, so severe it resembles open revolt. On Tuesday afternoon, January 20th, 2026, at 3:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the acting director of the Secret Service submitted her resignation to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Kimberly Cheetel, a 30-year veteran of the agency, reportedly cited irreconcilable differences with the president over the scope and legality of the orders she had been pressured to accept. This isn't a normal staffing change. This is the leader of presidential protection walking away. This is senior personnel seeking transfers off the presidential detail. This is agents trained to absorb threats, not to wage legal battles, quietly asking each other in hallways whether they can lawfully do what the president is demanding. Multiple sources speaking anonymously to major outlets have described a collapse in confidence, a grinding sense that professional lines are being tested beyond what career law enforcement officers can tolerate. The allegations are stark. Agents being asked to interfere with state and local officials executing lawful court orders. Agents being asked to physically block sheriffs from entering Trump properties. Agents being asked to choose between the immediate duty to protect the president and the larger oath to uphold the Constitution. The tension had been rising for months, but the New York asset seizure crisis pushed it to the edge. Secret Service agents are trained to take a bullet for a protectee. They are not trained to help a president obstruct justice. They are not trained to function as a personal militia in a legal war against state governments. And according to these accounts, that is precisely what they are refusing to become. The implications are enormous. A president who can no longer rely on unquestioned compliance from the very people tasked with his physical security, a chain of command fraying under political pressure, and a scenario in which the president may be more vulnerable, not because threats have vanished, but because the protective mission itself is being distorted into something agents believe they cannot ethically or legally support. Why is this happening now? Because the president has been pressing the Secret Service to cross boundaries that seasoned professionals will not cross, demanding they treat state officials as enemies, arguing that federal protective authority overrides state legal authority, and attempting to wield a historically apolitical agency as a political instrument. If that sounds unprecedented, it's because the United States has never faced a question at the center of this moment. What happens when a protective apparatus around a president resists him? To understand why the agency is in revolt, you have to understand what the president has allegedly been asking them to do, step by step, over the past 2 weeks. The crisis, according to sources, began on Monday, January 12th, when the New York Attorney General's office informed the Secret Service that state authorities would need access to Trump Tower to inventory commercial assets connected to a court-ordered receivership. Since the president took office, the Secret Service has controlled Trump Tower as a hardened security site, controlling entrances, screening visitors, and reportedly installing secure communication systems. In that framing, the tower isn't only a private residence. It functions as an operational hub and a contingency location, which makes any external intrusion a sensitive matter. But when the New York Sheriff's Office announced it intended to enter the building to execute the seizure order, the president allegedly reacted with fury and summoned the acting director to the Oval Office. According to accounts of that meeting, the president demanded that the Secret Service physically prevent New York law enforcement from entering Trump Tower. He argued the building should be treated as federal property because the president lives there. He argued state officials have no authority to enter, and he insisted that protecting the president's security necessarily includes shielding his properties from seizure. The acting director reportedly pushed back. The Secret Service exists to protect the president's person, not the president's private business interests. The agency can restrict access for safety when the protectee is present, but it cannot lawfully obstruct a valid state court order in commercial areas unrelated to immediate protective security. That explanation by these reports did not satisfy the president. He allegedly demanded the agency find a legal theory to justify intervention, invoking national security, claiming that entry could compromise classified systems, or declaring the entire building a restricted federal zone. Cheetel The accounts say, refuse and warn the president that what he was asking would be illegal. She reminded him that Secret Service agents swear an oath to the Constitution, not personal fealty to any one president. And she told him that if he insisted on that path, resignation would be the only option. The president reportedly backed down temporarily, but the conflict did not end. It shifted. Over the next week, he allegedly tried to bypass leadership, making direct appeals to senior agents on his detail. Instead of issuing formal directives, he asked individuals whether they would personally stand in front of doors and stop sheriffs from entering. He framed compliance not as policy, but as a loyalty test. Loyalty to him versus loyalty to bureaucratic rules. Some agents reportedly reported these conversations up the chain. Others were shaken enough to request reassignment away from the presidential detail. By Friday, January 16th, when Chitel learned the president was attempting to go around the chain of command, she confronted him. Leaked accounts describe a heated exchange. She warned he was undermining the agency, placing agents into an impossible position and poisoning morale. The president allegedly erupted, accusing her of disloyalty, invoking deep state language, and suggesting she should be fired and replaced by someone who would prioritize the president's needs above all else. The meeting ended with no resolution, and then the situation escalated again over the weekend. On January 18th and 19th, the president stayed at Mar-a-Lago and held a private meeting with former military and law enforcement figures from his informal advisory circle, private citizens, not government officials, but individuals who maintain direct influence. According to brief sources, the president discussed forming a private security force to supplement and potentially circumvent the Secret Service. The concept was simple and alarming. If the official protective agency refused to do what he demanded, he would hire contractors who would fund it through Trump organization accounts or loyalist donations, with a mandate to protect Trump properties from seizure and provide an additional security layer under his direct control. When word of this plan reached Secret Service leadership, it reportedly became the final straw. The idea of a president building a parallel security force outside the government chain of command is extraordinary, raising immediate concerns about authority, accountability, and the integrity of democratic institutions. It signals that the president no longer trusts the official protective apparatus and is willing to create an alternate structure loyal to him personally. On Tuesday morning, Chitel reportedly went to the Secretary of Homeland Security and resigned, explaining she could not continue serving a president actively undermining her agency while exploring the creation of his own private army. Her resignation was accepted immediately. By Tuesday afternoon, the story was leaking widely, and what might have been contained as an internal dispute became a national emergency of trust. And it wasn't happening in isolation. According to these accounts, the Secret Service is only the most visible flashpoint in a broader pattern of institutional resistance across federal law enforcement. The FBI has reportedly been in a state of quiet friction for months, with Director Christopher Wray described as having repeated confrontations with the president, resisting demands to investigate political opponents and state officials involved in New York's legal actions. The president, sources claim, wanted investigations open into New York Attorney General Letitia James, into judges involved in the asset process, and into the Attorney General's office itself, framing state enforcement as a criminal conspiracy against him. Wray, according to reports, refused, insisting that investigations must be driven by evidence of federal crimes, not presidential grievances, and warning that weaponizing the Bureau would violate its mission. The Department of Justice, too, is portrayed as fractured, an attorney general attempting to balance institutional independence with political expectations, authorizing narrow procedural filings while resisting pressure to turn the DOJ into the president's personal legal shield. Inside the department, career prosecutors are described as furious, viewing repeated demands as a corruption of purpose, with senior officials quietly considering exits if the pressure continues. Meanwhile, DHS leadership finds itself trapped. Appoint a loyalist to satisfy the president and risk an exodus of career agents. Appoint a professional committed to lawful boundaries and risk the president treating it as betrayal. Across the executive branch, the same dilemma is spreading. Obey orders that appear to demand ethical or legal violations, or resist, resign, or leak. That is what makes this moment so volatile. Not just one resignation, but a widening fracture between a president demanding personal loyalty and institutions designed to serve law, not a man. Operationally, the immediate fear is presidential security. The Secret Service is a highly professional organization with thousands of personnel, including the specialized division that directly protects the president. Elite agents trained to anticipate threats, coordinate with local authorities, and maintain a protective bubble in a world of constant risk. Day-to-day protection does not instantly collapse because the mission has protocols, but leadership matters. When an acting director resigns, decades of institutional knowledge and strategic continuity vanish overnight. If deputies consider leaving too, the agency loses long-range planning capacity. Interagency coordination becomes strained, and morale, already stressed by the nature of the work, can crater. More alarming is the prospect of significant transfers or resignations from the presidential detail. Replacing agents is not quick. Candidates undergo extensive vetting, psychological evaluations, and specialized training. If even a small percentage of protective personnel exit, coverage becomes thinner and risk increases. This is where the alleged private security idea becomes truly dangerous. Private contractors do not have the same legal authority as federal agents. They cannot claim federal jurisdiction. They do not operate under the same statutory restraints or oversight mechanisms. If private contractors attempt to block state law enforcement from executing a court order, those contractors could be arrested for obstruction, and the conflict will become an immediate law enforcement crisis. The legal confusion would be enormous, the political damage severe, and the physical risk unpredictable. Beyond authority, there is loyalty. Federal agents swear to the Constitution. Private security answers to whoever pays. If the president funds a contractor force through personal or corporate channels, that force is loyal to him personally, not to the office or to the law. That creates a parallel power structure outside democratic accountability, an arrangement more commonly associated with authoritarian systems than constitutional government. Intelligence and law enforcement professionals, as described by analysts following these developments, are watching with alarm, not just because of the immediate property disputes, but because a president with a personal security apparatus could theoretically use it to intimidate opponents, disrupt proceedings, or inflame chaos for political leverage. Some commentators reach for historical analogies. Paramilitary groups that enabled autocrats in other eras. Those comparisons may be exaggerated, but they reflect the intensity of the fear. Once a leader builds forces loyal to him rather than to the system, the rule of law begins to erode. Coordination with local law enforcement is another potential casualty. The Secret Service relies on state and local police to secure routes, venues, and emergency response whenever the president travels. If local officials begin to view the agency as politically compromised or as an instrument for obstructing state processes, cooperation could break down. That would weaken the protective envelope the president normally enjoys and create real vulnerabilities, not just for the president, but for everyone around him. And once the Secret Service's reputation as apolitical and professional is damaged, rebuilding trust becomes painfully slow. The constitutional stakes are even larger. The president has significant authority over the executive branch and the armed forces, but that authority is not unlimited. A president cannot lawfully create a private military force to enforce personal or outside established chains of command. If a privately funded security force acts at a president's direction to block lawful court action, key legal questions arise immediately. Who do they report to? What authority do they claim? And who is liable when rights are violated? If a contractor physically blocks a sheriff executing a court order, is that obstruction of justice? If the contractor claims the president told them to do it, does that provide immunity? Most legal experts argue no, but litigation can take years, and the chaos would be immediate. Some constitutional scholars argue that criminal liability could attach after a president leaves office. Others argue that using any force, official or private, to obstruct lawful processes could constitute impeachable conduct even while in office. Reports suggest congressional committees have begun discussing oversight and potential investigations, because the House has jurisdiction over the Secret Service and can demand testimony about political pressure on an agency designed to stand above politics. Yet even congressional action is slow, and the president, in this narrative, will be counting on delay, stretching time, creating confusion, and turning institutional friction into political theater. That is why this episode is being described not as a single scandal, but as a stress test of American democracy, a moment when institutions must decide whether they still function as checks on personal power. Those comparisons may be exaggerated, but they reflect the intensity of the fear. Once a leader builds forces loyal to him rather than to the system, the rule of law begins to erode. Coordination with local law enforcement is another potential casualty. The Secret Service relies on state and local police to secure routes, venues, and emergency response whenever the president travels. If local officials begin to view the agency as politically compromised or as an instrument for obstructing state processes, cooperation could break down. That would weaken the protective envelope the president normally enjoys and create real vulnerabilities, not just for the president, but for everyone around him. And once the Secret Service's reputation as apolitical and professional is damaged, rebuilding trust becomes painfully slow. The constitutional stakes are even larger. The president has significant authority over the executive branch and the armed forces, but that authority is not unlimited. A president cannot lawfully create a private military force to enforce personal, while outside established chains of command. If a privately funded security force acts at a president's direction to block lawful court action, key legal questions arise immediately. Who do they report to? What authority do they claim? And who is liable when rights are violated? If a contractor physically blocks a sheriff executing a court order, is that obstruction of justice? If the contractor claims the president told them to do it, does that provide immunity? Most legal experts argue no, but litigation can take years, and the chaos would be immediate. Some constitutional scholars argue that criminal liability could attach after a president leaves office. Others argue that using any force, official or private, to obstruct lawful processes could constitute impeachable conduct even while in office. Reports suggest congressional committees have begun discussing oversight and potential investigations, because the House has jurisdiction over the Secret Service and can demand testimony about political pressure on an agency designed to stand above politics. Yet even congressional action is slow, and the president, in this narrative, will be counting on delay, stretching time, creating confusion, and turning institutional friction into political theater. That is why this episode is being described not as a single scandal, but as a stress test of American democracy, a moment when institutions must decide whether they still function as checks on personal power. In the end, this story is not just about one resignation. It is about whether the institutions tasked with enforcing law and safeguarding democracy can withstand personal pressure from a president demanding that they bend rules for his benefit. The agents walking away in this framing are not betraying their mission. They are honoring it. They are loyal to their oaths, loyal to the Constitution, and loyal to the principles that law enforcement is supposed to serve. The president, in this narrative, is the one demanding betrayal, asking professionals to risk their integrity, their careers, and the legitimacy of their agencies for personal protection in a legal conflict. The same dynamic is now described as spreading across government. Career officials who join to serve the country being asked to serve one man's private interests and choosing instead to resist. That is the real crisis. Not only the legal and financial battle swirling around the president, but the loss of legitimacy and trust that makes governance possible. When a president is left with shrinking institutional support, a tight circle of loyalists, and the raw powers of office, the temptation to escalate grows. The Secret Service has sent a message. According to this account, they will not become a private army. They will not cross legal and ethical lines. And they will not sacrifice the Constitution for one man. The question now is how the president responds. Does he retreat and accept boundaries? Or does he double down, attempt to install loyalists, deploy private security, and dare the system to stop him? If he chooses escalation, the country could enter one of the most volatile periods of his presidency, not because of one dramatic headline, but because a collision between personal power and institutional law would move from whispers to open conflict in real time.